What a week! We've had tons of developments in the past few days, including in Ukraine. Here's the deal. Washington, Moscow, and Kyiv have reportedly agreed to a ceasefire when it comes to attacks in the Black Sea. The supposed goal? To ensure safe navigation in those waters. Take a look.
Russia and Ukraine agree naval ceasefire in Black Sea.
Okay, chances are you've heard the news exactly like that, just like we showed you. And of course, your first thought might be, wow, finally, Russia and Ukraine are starting to get along, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but what you just heard isn't exactly how things really went down. It's not what it looks like.
Russia and Ukraine agree Black Sea ceasefire, but Zelensky says Russia is lying about terms.
Ukraine is now saying that what Putin claims to have agreed on is not quite the same thing they agreed on. So wait a second, what kind of mess is this? Well, this time around, we don't have one deal, we have two completely separate ones. One between Ukraine and the United States, and another between Russia and the United States. Now, you might be thinking, alright Josh, no big deal. If the US makes a deal with Russia and also with Ukraine, it's basically like Russia and Ukraine made a deal with each other. Right? The US is just playing mediator here. And yeah, that would make sense if both deals were exactly the same. But the thing is, they're not. The Trump administration negotiated one thing with Ukraine and something quite different with Russia. So these two deals are substantially different. But that's not all. There's something else that makes this whole thing even weirder. Because despite the official announcement of a pause in attacks in the Black Sea, just hours after the White House made it public, attacks like this one were still happening.
Russia targets Black Sea port hours after maritime ceasefire announced.
That's right. Hours after the deal was supposedly in place, Russia was still launching drone strikes on the port of Mykolaiv and hitting other Ukrainian cities too. And here's the kicker. This shouldn't be surprising. Or at least it shouldn't come as a surprise. Pretty much the exact same thing happened with that so-called energy truce Moscow agreed to a few weeks ago. The one that, in practice, was never fully respected. So look, on the surface, this new Black Sea ceasefire might seem like a step toward peace. But if we dig a little deeper, things start to look, well, strange. This ceasefire has nothing to do with the Donbass, where fighting is actually ramping up. It's not about Zaporizhia either, where Russia and Ukraine are fighting over one of the most important nuclear plants in all of Europe. Nope. This new agreement is focused on the Black Sea, precisely the area where Russia has been losing ground in recent months.
Ukraine's ceasefire deal looks like a Russian wish list tied with a US bow. A moratorium on attacks on ships in the Black Sea seems to be contingent on sanctions relief, a key Kremlin demand.
For over a year now, the Russian Navy has been hammered by drone and missile attacks, forcing many of its ships to retreat. Russia, which practically controlled the Black Sea at the start of the invasion, has seen its grip on these waters weaken significantly, way more than Putin expected. So now we have to ask, who does this ceasefire actually benefit? Is it really about stabilizing the region, or is this just another concession to Moscow? Because, let's be real, Russia has shown zero intention of slowing down its offensive. In other areas, the bombing continues. Ground offensives are ongoing, and Moscow is still demanding outrageous concessions in exchange for any kind of broader ceasefire. And even with all that, Trump didn't even demand the full 30-day ceasefire that the US government itself had originally proposed. As we've already told you here on VisualPolitik, Moscow flat out rejected that idea, and instead, Trump struck a deal with Putin for a limited ceasefire focused only on energy facilities, basically to give Russia a breather and stop Ukrainian drones from targeting Putin's oil infrastructure. And now it gets even worse. Drone strikes, air raids, bombings, and ground attacks by Russia against Ukraine will continue, while Trump moves to ease sanctions on Russian state-owned banks. All of this to lock in a deal that, once again, overwhelmingly favors Moscow. It's nuts. At this rate, to Putin, Trump might as well be the best Santa Claus he could have dreamed of. The gifts and concessions just keep rolling into Moscow, and the Kremlin doesn't even have to lift a finger. Unreal. But why exactly are we saying that this Black Sea ceasefire mostly benefits Russia? Why is this deal happening right now? And to what extent is this just Trump kicking the European Union to the curb once again? Well, VisualPolitik community, in this video we're going to break down all the details of what looks like, without a doubt, the latest trick, the latest big win that Putin is pulling off at Trump's expense. So buckle up, because what we're about to tell you next is wild.
Why the Black Sea?
Pay close attention to this.
The Black Sea ceasefire is a great con. Trump has dealt an impossible hand to Zelensky. If Washington continues to deal with Moscow, things could rapidly deteriorate for Kyiv.
As we said earlier, this isn't a case of both sides sitting down face to face to hash out a single deal, or even both sides agreeing to the same terms. No, what we have here are two completely separate agreements. The United States reached a deal with Ukraine, where Kyiv agrees to halt attacks in the Black Sea. And on the other hand, Washington also signed a deal with Russia, where Moscow likewise promises to stop its attacks in the area. So far, it all sounds the same, right? Well, as we always say, the devil is in the details. And in this case, we might be witnessing yet another massive win for Putin in his negotiations with Trump.
Russia is winning concessions and buying time in ceasefire talks. Moscow's demands are slowing the process and giving it the advantage in talks with a deal-hungry United States, experts said.
Because with this deal, Moscow is securing several strategic advantages. First off, Putin is getting a break on sanctions, which of course is a top priority for the Kremlin. Washington is now taking steps to make it easier for Russia to export agricultural products and fertilizers. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The US has agreed to lift sanctions on Rosalkovsbank, Russia's agricultural bank. We're talking about a bank that's 100% state-owned, basically one of the Kremlin's financial arms. That's why, right now, under its sanctions from the US, the European Union, and the UK, these sanctions were put in place back in 2022 to choke off the flow of capital into Russia. And now, lifting those sanctions would allow the bank to operate normally again, giving Moscow access to new resources to fund things like arms purchases or recruitment operations. After all, with this move, any Russian company or government agency could open an account and carry out international transactions as if nothing had happened. And here's the kicker: Russia is getting all this without giving much up of anything. Because the truth is, the biggest winner in this deal is, you guessed it, Moscow. Why? Well, with this agreement in place, Russia no longer faces the same risks of losing ships in the Black Sea. Its navy can now get closer to the Ukrainian coastline, which opens the door to surveillance missions that could pave the way for more precise drone attacks. That's great news for Russia's territorial offensive, which right now is exactly what Putin cares about most. Because when the time comes to sit down and talk peace, the more Ukrainian territory Russia has managed to consolidate, the stronger its bargaining position will be. In other words, a pretty sweet deal for Putin, right? But now let's flip the question around. What does the other side get out of this? And I'm not just talking about Ukraine. I mean, what does the United States actually gain from this deal? Well, for the Trump administration, this is being sold as yet another political win. Trump and his allies are hailing it as a new diplomatic success, a big step towards stability, proof that Putin respects Trump as a strong leader, which is a relief. Otherwise, Trump might end up handing over South Carolina to Moscow. But here's the thing, like I was saying, they're bragging that, thanks to this new administration, the Black Sea is once again going to be a safe route for exporting grain and fertilizers. The problem is that, once again, the White House has given up more than it's gotten. Because as we've been saying, a safe Black Sea, on Russia's terms, ends up benefiting Russia above all. Look, back in 2022, there was a deal that let Ukraine export grain without its cargo ships being attacked by Russia. So why did Putin sign that deal? Well, simple, because it also allowed Russia to boost its own agricultural exports. But in 2023, Moscow unilaterally pulled out of the agreement. It accused the West of violating the deal and damaging Russian interests. And not only that, the Kremlin started threatening to attack any commercial vessel going to or from Ukraine. But you know what happened? Against all odds, Ukraine managed to keep its exports going without needing Russia's permission. Thanks to support from NATO countries in the region, a new maritime corridor was set up, one that allowed Ukrainian agricultural exports to recover to almost pre-invasion levels. Meanwhile, Russia's exports didn't recover the same way. And why am I telling you this? Because now, with this new deal, Russia is about to ramp up its grain and fertilizer exports back up, reconnect part of its financial system to the West, and get its ships closer to the Ukrainian coast for surveillance, all while Ukraine gets basically nothing. And neither does the United States. Once again, the only one walking away with a win is Vladimir Putin. But it doesn't stop there. This deal also feels like another slap in the face to Europe. Why? Well, just wait until you see what we're about to tell you next.
Trump's trap?
VisualPolitik community, as we've just seen, this so-called Black Sea ceasefire isn't a single deal. It's actually two separate agreements. But that's not even the most surprising part. The truth is, the United States has made unilateral concessions to Russia, concessions that Washington doesn't even have the authority to make. Trump has agreed to conditions that are literally outside of his control. So what are we talking about here? Well, for starters, there's the issue of lifting sanctions on the Russian Agricultural Bank and reconnecting it to the SWIFT international banking system. But wait, what exactly is SWIFT? Put simply, it's a global financial messaging network that connects over 11,000 financial institutions in more than 200 countries. Nearly 50 million financial messages are sent through this system every single day. So being a part of SWIFT basically means being part of the international financial system. And that makes this concession a huge win for Moscow. The problem? SWIFT is a cooperative based in Belgium, which means it falls under European Union jurisdiction. In other words, any move to lift sanctions involving SWIFT has to be approved by Brussels. No exceptions. And guess what? The European Union hasn't even been involved in these negotiations. That means Trump has gone ahead and promised Putin something that only Europe can deliver, and he's done it without consulting Brussels at all. He committed the EU to a policy shift it never signed off on. Do you remember these words?
Ultimately, it will reach a point if it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet. But if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved because they're the ones that were invaded, and the Europeans will have to be involved because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well.
Some say this is the way the United States is trying to bring Europe to the negotiating table. The problem is that it doesn't feel like an invitation, it feels more like an ultimatum, a slap in the face that leaves the European Union in a really tough spot. Because let's be honest, this deal should have been coordinated with Europe, especially when the sanctions being discussed are European sanctions. Instead, what we got was Trump and Putin cutting a deal behind Zelensky's back and then tossing it over to Europe and saying, here you have, sign this. But you know what? The European Union doesn't seem too eager to play along, at least not yet.
EU rejects Russian ceasefire demand for sanctions relief.
Brussels has made it clear they won't lift these sanctions until Russia ends the war and withdraws completely from all occupied Ukrainian territory. And that, obviously, is not going to happen. So why is Europe refusing to accept this concession? Simple, because it's basically a gift to Putin, one that would leave Brussels completely humiliated by Trump, and that is dangerous. Because the Russians can smell weakness. So if the EU looks like it's being pushed around, you can bet Moscow will come back for more. But that's not even the worst of it. Lifting sanctions without any real concessions from Moscow, while Russia still occupies 20% of Ukraine and launches daily attacks, would be a devastating blow to Kyiv. Let's be clear, this is another major US concession to Russia, in exchange for basically nothing. But even that's not the whole story. Because with moves like this, the White House might actually be trying to cover itself, just in case the whole negotiation process collapses later on. Think about it. Trump is repeatedly humiliating Europe while cutting deal after deal with Russia, and many of those deals require European approval. So if Brussels says no, and the negotiations fall apart, don't be surprised when the Trump camp turns around and blames its old European allies for everything. See? The Europeans don't want peace. They couldn't even lift a few minor sanctions. That's why this war isn't ending. That's one very real possibility. But VisualPolitik community, if you thought this was only about fertilizers, grain exports, and SWIFT access, you'd be very, very wrong. Pay close attention to this.
Russia and US discuss restarting Nord Stream pipelines, Kremlin says.
According to the Kremlin, Trump and Putin are already in talks about reconnecting the Nord Stream gas pipelines, the ones that used to deliver Russian gas directly to Germany. Remember, we're talking about a pipeline that suffered an unexplained explosion back in 2022, and to this day, no one really knows what happened. Well, this past February, the Kremlin reportedly tasked one of Putin's close allies with the mission of restarting gas supplies to Europe through Nord Stream, with the support of US investors. And now, they say discussions with Trump are already underway, something that, as you can imagine, hasn't exactly gone down well in Europe. Because once again, this is a matter that concerns Europe, not the United States.
It's bad for Europe. If Europe wants to support Ukraine, why get back on Russian gas? The fact the Nord Stream talks are happening without European involvement is insane.
Once again, Trump seems to want to strike deals unilaterally, and then, once everything is already agreed, ask the parts that are involved. Not good. But here's the thing, the most curious part of all this is that restarting Nord Stream would be bad for Ukraine, but it would also be very bad for the United States. Now why do I say that? Because throughout these years of war, US exports of liquefied natural gas to Europe have grown massively. Between 2018 and 2021, US LNG exports to Europe averaged 15 million tons per year, but after the war broke out, that figure quickly tripled. In fact, in this year, 2025, the International Energy Agency estimates, or at least estimated, that US gas exports would grow by 17%. In fact, Trump spent the campaign talking about how he would promote the massive sale of liquefied natural gas to the rest of the world. In other words, that he would accelerate a boom that was already underway. However, if Russian gas starts flowing back into Europe in large quantities, prices would drop, and many of the investments being made in the US would come to a halt. The American gas sector would lose a tremendous business opportunity. In short, we would be looking at yet another massive gift to Putin, one that, this time, would also be paid for by the US economy. Of course, if that happened, gas prices in the United States would fall sharply, which could allow the Trump administration to boast that households and businesses will have cheaper gas. The problem is that this would clash with the drill promise he made during the campaign. And not only that, it would also bring many future investments in production to a halt. It would be a classic case of short-term gain, long-term pain. Pure populism. The kind even Greta Thunberg might end up applauding. In any case, this would be yet another political point scored, and another economic win for Putin. VisualPolitik community, Trump's gifts to Russia keep on coming. And it's possible that the next ones will have to do with Russia's so-called Ghost Fleet. We're talking about some 1,300 merchant ships registered in other countries and operating under illegal practices. Ships that, in 2024, managed to transport 78% of the crude oil Russia exported by sea. According to several analysts, it's very likely that one of Putin's next requests to the White House will be related to this. Because, of course, when you enter into a dynamic of asking for and being given without anything in return, why change the strategy? But while we wait for the next gift, now it's your turn. What do you think about these parallel agreements? What do you think about Trump already agreeing to ease sanctions on Russia while the invasion is still going on? Do you think this is a trap for Europe? Let us know your thoughts down below in the comments, and let's open up the debate. And before you go, if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. Remember, it's free for you. As always, thank you so much for being there, take care, and I'll see you next time.